Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you so much for joining us. Boy, what a Friday. It's this you know as this weekend is taking place, I just can't imagine the number of people who will be working this weekend, not only in the United States but around the world, trying to figure out the impact the Supreme Court decision is having on Donald Trump's tariffs or tariff strategy and how it impacts commerce around the world. So this weekend, there's a lot of people trying to figure that out. And I'm sure one of those persons who is scratching his head, asking himself, what does this mean for Mexico, is Kenneth Smith. You all must know him well. He's been joining us throughout the years. He was the chief negotiator for the USMCA years ago. It seems like decades ago, considering, Ken, everything that's going on. And I know you have been following this court decision very closely. I think we've been waiting for weeks for the United States Supreme Court to decide whether IEEPA sanctions, which is this particular national security sanctions that the United States has, and it was used by Donald Trump to impose sanctions around the world, was going to be constitutional or not. Well, the Supreme Court came out and this decision, in a 6-3 decision, ruled that it does not, Donald Trump does not have this sweeping authority. And of course, I don't know, Ken, if you watched the president's press conference, but boy, he was mad. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Ana Maria. It's great to be with you here once again.
So, just briefly describe to us, what does this decision mean? Let's talk about in terms of Donald Trump's tariff strategy, and then we can talk about the rest of the world. And then, obviously we have to talk about Mexico, but just give us the rundown.
No, thank you very much for the invitation. Well, I mean, I think it's very good news to have had this decision by the Supreme Court, which was not something unexpected either. I mean, at the end of the day, it ratifies the decision taken last year in the International Court of Trade of New York, where it was clearly defined that President Trump overstepped his authority by utilizing the IEEPA authority, the IEEPA law, in order to manipulate tariffs, and to do so without even approaching Congress, which also has a very strong role to play legally and constitutionally in international trade in the United States. So it was not unexpected. As you said, we had been expecting this decision perhaps since December, then it was January, then we finally got it. And it is an important blow to one of the key pillars of the trade policy of President Trump, based on the ability to anytime, any place, and with very quick turnaround to be able to impose tariffs against his main trading partners, and therefore utilize those tariffs as tools of coercion or pressure in the bilateral negotiations that he's engaging in. Obviously, by taking away the IEEPA tariffs, he has two immediate problems. The first one is that he has to lower those tariffs to all those countries with many of them, he continues to negotiate bilaterally. So we'll have to see what the reaction is by these countries. And also, even though the Supreme Court did not say anything on the matter, the United States will have to refund billions of dollars if requested by the companies and the people that are suing the US government. And we hear that we have numbers in terms of revenue generation in the United States, which I put under quote marks because it's not really revenue from other areas of the world. It's actually a tax on US consumers. But apparently more than $175 billion have entered US coffers because of the tariffs. So that's a lot of billions to refund in case, as President Trump said, this will go to litigation and then there may be unfavorable decisions against the US government. So that puts him in a bind. I think for Mexico, it's important to get rid of the IEEPA tariffs because you know that we did not have reciprocal tariffs. There was a partial recognition, so to speak, of the USMCA, so that within the IEEPA tariffs that were assessed on Mexico, anything that comes into the United States complying with the USMCA rule of origin does not pay the tariff. And that's about 80% of what we export to the US is tariff free. But so it helps that other 20% that was paying tariffs. And it does establish I think a step forward in what Mexico has been trying to accomplish over the last year, which is get rid of the tariffs that we have on top of us. This doesn't get rid of all of them. We still have automotive tariffs and also steel and aluminum. And we have looming ahead of us possible tariffs on more investigations on 232, Section 232 of the US trade law on national security, on semiconductors, aerospace, copper, pharmaceuticals, a bunch of products. So it's a step in the right direction, but right now it's not clear even how he's going to implement the decision by the Supreme Court. And already President Trump announced that he's going to use other tools in his toolkit to impose tariffs, which is in this case specifically, he said he was going to use Section 122, global tariffs of 10% on all countries. And it's not clear how that is going to affect Mexico or Canada as of yet.
So when that's what I wanted to ask you. I mean, I guess the first question is, does that 10% include Canada and Mexico? And how does that, what does that mean in terms of these tariffs that Mexico's already paying for some of those products? I mean, is it 10% more? I mean, I'm very confused about that statement.
Yeah, well, when the president of the US talks about a global 10% tariff, we have to assume that it covers all countries. We do not know that. That's another element that we have to see once the ink is dry on the executive order and how they're thinking of applying this and implementing this. And there are several questions on the Mexico side, which everybody around the world is asking. First of all, in the case of Mexico and Canada, will we get the same type of treatment that we got on the original IEEPA tariffs? In other words, excluding from the tariff all products that comply with USMCA, yes or no? We do not know that. And also, a very important point you touched upon, which is when the US started applying all these tariffs on automotive goods, steel and aluminum, IEEPA, one of the things they did because of pressure of the US producers, as a matter of fact, and importers from Mexico and Canada, is to not have a stacking effect of the tariffs. In other words, you don't have, for example, for vehicles, the IEEPA tariffs plus the automotive tariff, plus the 50% on steel and aluminum. Otherwise, you would have had sectors that are key for the US economy paying tariffs of 80, 90, or 100%, right? So they avoided that type of stacking. We do not know if in this 10% global tariff that might or might not affect Mexico, there will also be measures to avoid that type of stacking. In other words, the best scenario possible right now would be a 10% tariff only on the goods that do not comply with the USMCA, which, as I said, is a small proportion of what we export to the United States, and also that there's no stacking, no added on tariffs to steel and aluminum and to automotive goods.
And of course, this decision comes the same week that there was a strong statement made again by President Donald Trump, where he is considering to not negotiate a trade agreement or not have Canada be part of the USMCA. At the same time, Mexican officials and Canadian officials met in Mexico City. Apparently, there was a very good meeting to talk about the USMCA and positions that the countries may take. So I'm just, in this environment, how is Mexico, Canada, and Canada going to negotiate a USMCA agreement? And why negotiate it? Because there is a USMCA agreement right now, and he's still clearly violating at least the spirit of the agreement. So what does Mexico get from negotiating a USMCA agreement right now?
Well, the US is violating the spirit and the letter of the agreement because you cannot impose tariffs the way the US has imposed tariffs.
Right.
That's one thing that has to be said very clearly. And yes, you are correct. Mexico and Canada still have the USMCA in place, and we're not applying those ridiculous tariffs to each other. So what happens is that the USMCA text, the agreement, establishes that every 6 years there has to be a comprehensive review of the agreement. It is not an automatic renegotiation. It is a process by which the three countries analyze how the agreement is operating and what kind of recommendations could be put forward to improve its operation. Right. And that does not preclude or does not prohibit one or more USMCA party countries requesting a renegotiation, which is what we expect the US to do on several fronts, on the issue of trying to contain China, to limit the products that come into the North American supply chains by trying to make, for example, the rules of origin in the auto sector tighter, or having investment screening to try to block out Chinese investments in sectors that the US considers strategic for its national security, et cetera, et cetera. So we're in a situation in which this review will take place, and the goal, at least from the Mexican perspective, I don't think it'll be the Mexican government that asks for a renegotiation.
No.
It must be ready for one because the US might put all those elements that I mentioned and many other more on the table. But it must, at the very least, come out and defend free trade, establish with the United States the notion that it is precisely by virtue of not having tariffs between the three North American countries that we have been able to strengthen our competitiveness over the last 30 years. And eliminating tariffs and obstacles, non-tariff barriers between the three countries is really the only way that the US will successfully compete with China in the future. So the US economy needs Mexico. Mexico needs the US economy as well. And hopefully, Mexico and Canada were working actively on strengthening their own bilateral relations. And you mentioned this historic trade mission that came from Canada to Mexico. It's precisely the directive, the mandate that Prime Minister Carney established since his speech in Davos, talking about diversification, strengthening alliances, and not only depending on the US. But of course, we have to be realistic. For both Mexico and Canada, the US will always be the number one trading partner and number one investor. But it is a very positive development that Mexico and Canada are speaking. They're talking about strengthening the bilateral relationships and trying to push for having not only a successful review of the agreement in 2026, but to have it remain a trilateral agreement.
So what if because there's so many things going on this year, in addition to this Supreme Court decision that we were all following very closely because we know the impact this could have on the negotiation. But also there are midterm elections in the United States, and it just seems that most of the decisions that Trump is going to be making between now and the end of October, he's going to have the midterm elections in mind and the possibility that he could lose, if not one, but both chambers, the Senate and Congress and the lower house. So, I mean, if they're going to renegotiate an agreement, he would have to have Congress on board. Or am I wrong?
Yeah, and that's going to be an important debate legally within the US. Everything that Trump has been trying to do right now with other countries is to negotiate bilateral deals and leave Congress out of the conversation. And it's an added level of complication is the deals that the US is doing with countries with whom it already had free trade agreements in place. Let's take, for example, Korea. The KORUS has been in effect for many years with a clear schedule of elimination of tariffs, trade rules, science-based mechanisms for sanitary and phytosanitary measures, so on and so forth. All of a sudden, the president not only hits him with tariffs, which violates that agreement, but is now negotiating a bilateral deal which has different commitments from what is in the KORUS, which is US law at the moment. So my big question immediately, even before the USMCA, how are they going to implement that? What is going to be the guiding legal instrument for trade relationship between the US and Korea? The same with Guatemala, El Salvador. They already had the CAFTA. So the big question is, the US is claiming that these deals they're making are complementary to the existing trade agreements, but there are commitments on tariffs, on quantitative restrictions that are contradictory in the deals that they're negotiating right now with the free trade agreements that they have in place. So when you turn to the USMCA, the question is the same. We have a trade agreement, and the US may actually try to argue that the changes that it wants to make in the agreement are not actually a reopening of commitments, a renegotiation, because in that case, they would be forced to present it to Congress. They may argue that they may be able to obtain the acquiescence of Mexico and Canada to make changes through side agreements, MOUs, side letters, et cetera, et cetera. But legally, it doesn't necessarily hold. If you change the rules of origin to prohibit Chinese components, for example, you can't just simply, in my opinion, and the legal experts in the US will have to debate this, you can't just do it through a side letter because that changes the substantive commitments established in the text of the agreement. So that's going to be a back and forth that's going to be discussed, I think, throughout the year. And hopefully in the next couple of weeks or months, probably not until probably the end of the spring, will we have a clear view or idea as to the specific changes that the US wants to introduce into the USMCA.
What would happen if basically Mexico just basically said we can't do this review right now, or we have to wait till the end of the year, or they drag their feet? Because I think that almost has to be the strategy, because it's really difficult to figure out what the USMCA is going to look like unless we understand what Congress is going to look like and whether they're willing to speak up and say, there's parts of this agreement is illegal because it needs it's a renegotiation. This has to come to us. So it seems very difficult to be able to reach any type of agreement, whether it's a renegotiation or just a kind of a statement of that basically says that all three countries reviewed the USMCA like it's stated in the agreement right now.
Well, I think the Mexican government has done the right thing in insisting that it's willing to negotiate, to insist that dialogue is the way forward. It hasn't established retaliatory measures as Canada and other countries have done.
Right.
So that has worked so far to avoid a more radical position by President Trump. And, of course, if Mexico said, I don't want to play ball, I don't want to go ahead with this review, the only thing that would cause is perhaps the US to threaten even higher tariffs on Mexico, right? So I think the approach, and I don't even think it's a question of Mexico wanting to drag its feet. It's a question of if the US puts all these elements that we're hearing that it wants to put on the table for the discussion of the USMCA review, those are substantive changes. These are not things that you solve in 2 weeks. Right? And look at the other deals that the US is doing with the other countries. Back in the last spring in 2025, the US was triumphantly announcing that it was doing deals with the EU, with the UK, with Japan. Those are still ongoing because it's one thing to come out and announce politically or for media reasons that you're closing a deal and saying what are the objectives of the agreement, but then you have to get to brass tacks and push the pencil and work at the technical level on getting the negotiation done. And even those negotiations have been going on for almost a year. So I think naturally in the process of the review, it's likely to go beyond July, and it's likely that it'll overlap or go beyond even the midterm elections. And I think that could work to the advantage of Mexico and Canada, because once you get Congress in the conversation, especially if there's a change in terms of the control of Congress by the Democrats, as you mentioned, in the House of Representatives and the Senate, then that introduces a whole set of potential allies to the cause of maintaining free trade, and you saw a recognition at the very least, and this was positive, by U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer when the ambassador went to Congress at the end of December, and he publicly recognized that the majority of the letters that the U.S. Trade Representative received in the process of a public consultation on the USMCA, over 80% of those were in favor of maintaining and extending the agreement. So I don't think we'll see a collapse of the USMCA. The US and Mexico and Canada really can't afford it. It's too big to let it fail. And I think there would be tremendous pressure in the United States, which we have to make sure that happens, from the private sector, NGOs, Congress, governors that know their economies depend on
But who, by
having
the
trade
way,
with
have
Mexico
not
and
spoken
Canada
up very.
raising their voice.
No, I agree with you, but these stakeholders, I love that word, stakeholders, they have really not spoken up very much in the last as this debate is taking place. And there could be different reasons why, because I'm sure they're just watching to see at what point Trump changes his mind again. But there is a problem, that a fundamental problem with all of this is that even though we already have a trade agreement, Trump is violating the trade agreement. And what guarantee is there that, at least we know he's not going to be able to impose IEEPA sanctions in the future, but what agreement is there that even though you have a trade agreement with the United States, Trump is not going to, use some of these other trade weapons that he has, that he, for example, this 10% that he announced, this Friday. So, I mean, I mean, how can you agree? And I mean, how can you negotiate in this environment?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a level of trust and confidence and reliability that has been lost over the last year based on
Right.
many of the decisions that the U.S. government has taken in terms of its trade and foreign policy, and it's certainly impacting Mexico. But that's why I think Mexico, as the government, has taken the right approach in saying we're ready to negotiate and to honor the commitments that we have in the agreement. We
Right.
hope that you do the same, and we're willing to sit down and hammer out a deal going forward that strengthens
Mhm.
the economies of North America. But you are right. We do not have a guarantee that even if we finish the review of the USMCA successfully, either in 26 or in 2027, it can go even
Mhm.
beyond. While Trump is in power, you're never sure if the day after signing a deal,
Mhm.
he might change his mind and start imposing tariffs under whatever argument that he might come up with that morning.
Mhm.
So, yes, we face uncertainty. I think
Mhm.
there will be a lot of turbulence, a lot of threats by Trump to pull out of the agreement. He loves
Mhm.
to go to extremes just to try to obtain specific concessions. So don't be surprised if throughout the USMCA review he claims that he does not need Mexico, he does not need Canada, that he could do
Right.
without the agreement. But that is why it's very important for the U.S. private sector to
To
speak its
start,
voice
yeah, to start
loudly.
speaking up.
Now, I
Yeah.
agree with you that they have been kind of quiet over the first 6 months of the
Mhm.
Trump administration. Everybody was trying to figure out where they stood. And of course, there's a concern with Trump signaling them out and attacking them directly. But I
Mhm.
think ever since the process of consultation began in USTR and they received over 1,500 letters in favor of
Mhm.
the agreement, I think they're starting to speak up. A coalition on agricultural exporters from the
Mhm.
US was formed recently. I
Mhm.
myself am working with former Chairman Kevin Brady of Ways and Means
Mhm.
and Steve Rahul, my counterpart in the USMCA negotiation, in the Coalition for North American Trade. It is a
Mhm.
trilateral organization that is bringing together companies, trade associations, NGOs,
Mhm.
and think tanks to
Mhm.
provide advocacy activities and hard data on the benefits of trade at the local level throughout the United States. So
Mhm.
efforts are burgeoning. I think that we need to do much more. This is the time to really put
Mhm.
the foot on the accelerator. And I
Mhm.
hope that through those efforts and the efforts of the negotiators of Mexico and Canada,
Mhm.
we can bring this to a successful conclusion. But it will be a very tough road ahead.
Mm. Well, it's always good to talk to you, Kenneth Smith. He was the chief negotiator for the original USMCA, and he's also a partner at Aegon, which is this consulting firm. And I'm sure you all are very busy this weekend. So I really appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much,
It's a real pleasure, Ana Maria, as always.
Kenneth Smith. We're going to go to commercial break. I'm Ana Maria Salazar, and don't forget we continue to broadcast every weekend here through